Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you guys seem to have really enjoyed us diving back into some Historia Civilis yesterday, talking about Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So we're going to go ahead and do the next episode in that sequence from Historia Civilis. This is Caesar marches on Rome. It's what happened after he crossed the Rubicon. So that was an important part of the story to continue on with. We're not going to go straight through all of these, but we will revisit from time to time, especially now that I'm in kind of a Roman history mode since experiencing so much of it. I am in the process as well of finishing up the next video for Stories of the Great War, which will be going live here in the next couple of days about the Welsh division at Mametz Wood. Also planning my next trip to the Western Front, which is just about a month away, with some friends. I'll tell you more about that as we get closer. The link is in the description to Historia Civilis. They are at 982,000 subscribers, which means closing in on that gold play button for 1 million. So if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to check out their channel and subscribe if you like what you see. I think they're one of the best channels on YouTube as far as history content goes, so definitely worth your time. Let's get them pushed over 1 million. Let's go ahead and dive into this one. Just a reminder, if you didn't see yesterday's episode, this is all part of a playlist, so you can check it out. I'll also put the link down in the description if you want to check that one out first before we do this one.
In 49 BCE, a provincial governor named Julius Caesar led an armed insurrection against the Senate and people of Rome. He commanded 10 legions, which was a lot, and although they remained personally loyal to him, most of them were hunkered down all the way up in Gaul for the winter. Only one, the 13th Legion, was in any position to be of use in the short term. At half strength, the 13th consisted of approximately 2,500 soldiers, and the moment these soldiers crossed into Italy, it amounted to a declaration of war.
Think about that, though. We're talking about half a legion. I mean, this is not a lot of men, and this is something that Caesar actually offered, as part of his negotiating with everyone, is he offered to give up control of 9 other legions and only keep one, and I'm guessing the 13th probably would have been that one, since that's who was with him at the time. And remember, too, that the person that is kind of being chosen to head up the opposition, or the soldiers for the Senate, is Pompey, and they've got a long history together. Not only was Caesar Pompey's father-in-law, even though he's younger than Pompey, because Pompey was married to Caesar's daughter, Julia, but they also were a part of what people sometimes call the first triumvirate. I know a lot of historians don't like using that term, but they were with Crassus as part of this first triumvirate about a decade earlier, so they've got a long history together.
Way up in Gaul, Caesar's close friend and right-hand man Labienus had been left in charge of Caesar's legions in his absence. Labienus knew that there was a political back and forth going on in the south, but assumed that everything would be fine. Well, everything was not fine. When negotiations broke down, news started trickling in that Caesar had risen up in open rebellion and was in the process of marching on Rome. Labienus was shocked. Let's not forget that up until this moment, Labienus's achievements in Gaul had been truly remarkable. He had spent the last 10 years leading semi-independent military operations in Caesar's name. Labienus was the only man Caesar trusted to take command of the Republic's largest army in his absence. In fact, I would argue that Labienus deserves half the credit for the conquest of Gaul.
I'm starting to get the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, that there's a bit of anti-Caesar bias going on with Historia Civilis. And listen, I acknowledge, and I say this all the time, if you're new to the channel, we all have bias. We're all biased by our worldview, our religion, our upbringing, our social status, our wealth, our education, what part of the world we live in, the trauma that we've experienced in our lives. It all affects us. And so when I say that he seems biased, I'm recognizing I'm definitely biased. So are you. So is everybody else watching this.
Like Caesar, Labienus actually lived on deployment with the legions. And unlike Caesar, Labienus's military record was an unbroken string of victories. Without any exaggeration, Labienus was up there with Pompey and Caesar as one of Rome's greatest living generals. and this fact may have caused some animosity. Had Labienus devoted the last 10 years to his own advancement rather than Caesar's, he would have been one of the most influential men in Rome. Now, Labienus was over 50, and if he was ever going to translate his military success into political power, it was going to be as one of Caesar's men.
Here's the bottom line with this. Most men who rise to the highest levels of power do so at least in part because of an ego, because of ambition. Even people like George Washington, who a lot of people point to as kind of this virtuous example of a modern Cincinnatus who had everything there and chose not to take it. Even he displayed a very ambitious attitude at some points. He showed up to the Second Continental Congress wearing his military uniform and then was really humble when offered the command. I mean, listen, there's always some bit of ambition, and the most ambitious men, if you couple that extreme ambition with a great deal of skill in a guy like Caesar, sky's the limit.
Caesar noticed this shift in attitude. As time went on, he granted Labienus more and more independence, and gave every indication that the Gallic provinces would be his whenever Caesar returned to Rome. Finally, Labienus would get an independent command. Some whispered that the consulship might follow. But then, Caesar rose up in open rebellion against the Senate and people of Rome. From what we can tell, he didn't even bother to consult with Labienus before doing so.
Why would he have? First of all, Labienus is not anywhere near it. He's way up there in kind of the modern day Alsace region, kind of maybe Belgium, that area. He's hundreds of miles removed from this. And as far as Caesar's concerned, this is not a rebellion. In his mind, this is him just going to assert his personal rights. It really has nothing to do with Labienus. I don't see why he would have consulted him.
Labienus was angry. I would have been angry too. Labienus had hitched his wagon to Caesar, and now Caesar had decided to foolishly run off a cliff. And it wasn't all about ambition. If we are to believe Labienus's surviving words, which in fairness come to us through biased sources, he considered taking up arms against the Senate morally repugnant. Absent any data to the contrary, I see no reason not to believe him. This was the most important decision of his life, and taking his reasoning behind it seriously is the least we can do.
So, I'm starting, you're going to notice I'm going to kind of push back against some of what I'm perceiving as this bias against Caesar here. If we apply the logic that, well, we only have one side, and since there's no information to the contrary, then we should just go with the one side, then that same logic would say that a lot of what we know about the Gallic Wars, which we only know because of Caesar, should also be taken at face value because there's no data to the contrary. Just because you don't have another side of the story doesn't mean that the side you're getting isn't biased. I'm not saying one way or the other. I don't know about that logic.
Without too much fuss, Labienus immediately left camp, accompanied by a large contingent of cavalry that were personally loyal to him. He made no attempt to bring along any of Caesar's legions. Once free, Labienus publicly denounced Caesar as a traitor and pledged his loyalty to the Senate. He would join up with the Pompeians in Italy.
And I'm guessing Labienus may not have all the facts. I'm not saying he was right or wrong to side with the Senate, but I'm wondering how much most people knew about the inner workings of what was going on with everything we talked about in yesterday's episode about the back and forth and the negotiating and the reasons for Caesar doing what he's doing.
This was an unexpected blow to Caesar. The two had been close friends for at least 14 years, probably longer. Labienus had earned Caesar's absolute confidence. It was a big deal. But for what it's worth, Labienus made no attempt to stab Caesar in the back by stealing his legions. He could have, but he didn't. That's worth something.
Caesar... Yeah, and keep in mind, too, that once this all goes down and Caesar comes out victorious, he's actually pretty magnanimous in terms of his the way that he confronts those who opposed him. guys like Brutus, guys like Pompey. He was ready and willing to forgive. Now, that may have been a calculated decision on his part for the good of Rome or to consolidate his own power. I'm not saying it wasn't motivated by those things, but he wasn't out for blood. He wasn't out to get revenge initially on the people who opposed him.
Caesar ordered his men back in Gaul to pack up Labienus's personal belongings and have them shipped to Italy. Some historians have described this as a callous reaction to a loss of a friend, but I don't see it that way at all. Labienus had lived in Gaul for 10 years, and then just walked away with nothing. To my eyes, it's a small act of compassion to be like, sure, follow your conscience if you must, but you're gonna need all your stuff once you get back to Italy.
So I'll give him this. On that part, he did not show the expected bias against Caesar. I think he kind of saw Caesar for the benefit of the doubt on that one, so I'll acknowledge that.
When Cicero learned that Labienus had defected from Caesar, he wrote, "Labienus seems to have condemned a friend of his of a crime for the sake of the Republic." Continuing, he wrote, "I judge Labienus a hero. It has been a long time since a more glorious political move. If Labienus has accomplished nothing else, he has caused Caesar pain." I would add to Cicero's thoughts, if Labienus had accomplished nothing else, he had deprived Caesar of a skilled lieutenant. In that respect, he was irreplaceable.
There's other skilled lieutenants.
When news traveled south, there was panic on the streets of Rome. The Senate was as surprised as anybody. They had been keeping a close eye on Caesar's legions north of the Alps.
It baffles me that the Senate was surprised by this. This has been going on for a couple of years. This has been a constant threat and a constant possibility. And as negotiations have broken down and you've gotten to the place where there's nothing else to do, and now you've raised Pompey as your leader to defend Rome using the military, what did you think was going to happen?
If these legions moved, they told themselves, that meant that Caesar was gearing up for an invasion. Well, those legions hadn't moved. Caesar invaded anyways. Now, the recriminations began. The warhawks in the Senate started pointing fingers, arguing that Pompey had walked them into this mess. It's not true, by the way.
Look at how quickly they turn on each other. Things are falling apart, and when things fall apart, people look for somebody to blame, and Caesar's not there. He's been the guy they've been blaming, but Caesar's not there, so the people who were kind of on Caesar's side anyway in the Senate are obviously going to point at Pompey, because Pompey could have ended all of this by just stepping down at the same time as Caesar.
If anything, it was the other way around. The warhawks walked Pompey into this mess.
I disagree with that.
There were legions mustering to the south, but they wouldn't be ready for some time. And even when they were, these raw recruits wouldn't stand much of a chance against Caesar's hardened legion.
Yeah.
There
Hardened half legion.
were more experienced legions in Spain and Greece, but it would take months to get them over to Italy. In the defense of the Pompeians, it was winter, and they had assumed that they would have months to get ready. They were just wrong.
This is what happens when you assume, especially against a guy like Caesar. Caesar, again, he knows these people. This is one of the advantages you have when you're dealing with what's basically a civil war, is that he knows his opponent because he has served with them. He has grown up with them. He knows Pompey. He knows what Pompey's going to do. He understands the Senate. He understands Italy. And he knows that if he moves quickly with a small force, he can get there before anybody can do anything about it.
In Rome, those who could packed up their belongings and fled the city. When Cicero learned that Caesar's march south was creating a steady stream of Roman refugees, he remarked, "Are we talking about a Roman general here, or Hannibal?"
I understand that a lot of people considered staying in Rome as tantamount to siding with Caesar. And so fleeing, I think, may be more about making a political statement, at least as far as the wealthy upper classes go.
Pompey could see no way around it. He would not be able to mobilize a resistance in time. He would have to temporarily abandon the city of Rome. His reasoning was sound. He had access to the vast resources of Rome's provinces. He had more legions. He had more money. He had the Senate on his side. The longer this conflict continued, the stronger Pompey would become. Caesar's only hope was to force an early confrontation.
And again, if you take Caesar at his word that this is really about just asserting his rights and not about a military coup or about conquering, then I guess in Caesar's mind you're thinking, well, maybe I can force this to a negotiation before it turns into a full-blown civil war.
Pulling back, Pompey denied Caesar this opportunity. It was the right call under the circumstances.
I agree.
But that doesn't mean it was popular. Being forced to abandon the capital isn't a great way to start a war. Rome's most prominent senators violently disagreed with the decision. Cicero was particularly upset. He asked Pompey, whom he had been privately calling the Senate's incompetent leader, if he intended to make a stand in southern Italy. Pompey wouldn't give him a straight answer. Cicero reluctantly agreed to obey the Senate's order, but decided not to go with Pompey. He would remain in the Italian countryside, ready to return to Rome at a moment's notice. The young senator Marcus Junius Brutus was also quite torn.
Yeah.
On paper, it should have been a no-brainer, since his beloved uncle was none other than the arch-conservative Cato. But it was more complicated than that. Brutus's mother was Caesar's longtime mistress, and the two men seemed genuinely affectionate towards each other. Plus,
so one thing to keep in mind when you're talking about how all these guys are related is understand that, especially if your view of all these events is from HBO's Rome, which is fantastic, by the way. And I just was reading yesterday about they had 5 seasons planned. And the last season was actually going to involve kind of the storyline that involved Jesus in what was then Judea and in Galilee, but they never got that far. But Cato is often portrayed as being an older man, but he's actually only in his 40s at this point. So, just keep that in mind that, yes, he's Brutus's uncle, and later I think he becomes Brutus's father-in-law because Brutus divorces his wife and ends up marrying Cato's daughter, but there's all those kind of weird relationships going on.
Plus, there was an additional wrinkle. When Brutus was a child, Pompey had personally ordered the death of his father. The hatred ran deep. To this day, Brutus could barely bring himself to speak to the man. After an intense period of soul-searching, Brutus decided that the Republic's integrity was more important than his personal feelings. He pledged his loyalty to his father's killer and accompanied Pompey into southern Italy. Domitius Ahenobarbus, another powerful senator, was angry. Domitius was the guy who had been selected by the Senate to replace Caesar in Gaul whenever he resigned his command. Now, Domitius was one of the many who were furious at Pompey's decision to abandon the capital. Without bothering to consult with Pompey or the rest of the Senate, Domitius grabbed 10,000 militiamen and raw recruits and marched north. He would stop Caesar's advance or die trying.
So if you are the guy who's tapped to replace Caesar, and so you're obviously a person of some military ambition yourself, you're seeing an opportunity here. I'll go take care of Caesar. I've got 10,000 men. I outnumber him 4-1. This will be easy. I'll be the one who put down the rebellion. I'll be a hero to the Republic. Ambition. All of these people are thinking not only about what's best for the Republic, but also what's best for them and their families. There's all of these competing things, feelings and emotions and motivations going on at once.
This was not as crazy as it might seem. Against Caesar's 1/2-strength legion, Domitius would have outnumbered him 4-1.
Yep.
However, things had changed in the last few weeks. As soon as he crossed the Rubicon, Caesar split up his tiny legion and captured 5 cities in rapid succession, all uncontested. One of these detachments was led by Mark Antony, who I would like to note was still technically a tribune of the plebs. Tribunes were forbidden to leave Rome while in office, and not only had Antony left the city, but here he was returning at the head of a rebel army.
Again, we said it yesterday, we'll say it again today. The law is the law until it's convenient to ignore it. Yeah, these are all these rules, but pretty much everybody at this point is just acknowledging the law when it works for them and ignoring it when it doesn't.
Things were so chaotic at this time that it never even occurred to anybody to strip him of office. But they should have. Now that Caesar had a foothold in Italy, he ordered his legions north of the Alps to join him. He spent the rest of January capturing cities in the north. Apart from one tiny skirmish, all of the defending garrisons either fled or defected to his side. With reinforcements coming down from the north and defectors coming up from the south, Caesar's one legion ballooned into 5 or 6. By early February, Domitius Ahenobarbus arrived at the town of Corinium with 10,000 men,
Surprise!
which equaled like 2 legions. Caesar would have to pass this way before heading further south. Domitius knew that for him, this was probably a one-way trip, but if everything went well, it would give Pompey enough time to marshal his resources and march north.
If that's what Domitius is thinking about. Is he thinking about buying time for Pompey, or is he thinking about his own glory? I don't know the answer. I'm asking that question. Let me know what you think.
Intercepting Caesar before he reached Rome. When Caesar's legions showed up outside the walls of Corinium, the civilians inside the town immediately lost heart and tried to surrender. Besieged, and with no sign of support from Pompey, Domitius's 10,000 recruits and militiamen realized this was a suicide mission. They mutinied against their commander, opened the gates of the town, and hauled Domitius before Caesar. Domitius was humiliated. He begged for death, believing that the execution of a former consul would serve as a rallying cry for the rest of Italy. Instead, Caesar surprised everybody by publicly pardoning Domitius.
And this is not, as I said earlier, the last time that Caesar will do this. He will pardon most of the men who are on the opposite side in all of this.
And letting him walk away a free man. Caesar justifies his clemency by saying that he had no interest in alienating politicians or the public with unnecessary brutality. If he was victorious, he wanted his victory to last, and to do that, he would need the cooperation of his former enemies.
So, again, you can argue Caesar is doing this in a calculated way, or you can say, you know what, maybe he means what he says when he's not really trying to overthrow the government. He's just trying to get what he believes belongs to him. And this would all be consistent with that. Either way, I mean, there's probably some truth to both. You know, Caesar probably is doing this in a very calculated way, but I think there's also some truth to what he's claiming.
That's the reason he gave. The real reason might be a little less high-minded. When Domitius's 10,000 men discovered that Caesar had pardoned their former commander, many broke ranks and volunteered to join Caesar's legions. Now Domitius was angrier than ever. He immediately began planning a second high-risk operation to save the Republic. He'd be back. By now, Caesar had approximately 6 legions in Italy, while Pompey was still struggling to rally 2 or 3 legions in the south. Pompey began to seriously consider abandoning the Italian peninsula. The Pompeians still held the overall advantage, even though locally they were outnumbered. In time, the combined strength of the provinces would surely be enough to overpower Caesar's rebellion.
I feel like we've already said this once and it didn't work out. How many more times is this going to be said during these civil wars?
With his mind made up, Pompey began to evacuate his army from southern Italy. Pompey marched his legions to the port city of Brundisium to make the crossing to Greece. It didn't take long for Caesar to figure out where he was going. He abandoned all of his previous plans and made a beeline for southern Italy.
Now you're bottled up.
By the time Caesar arrived, Pompey had occupied Brundisium, and half of his army had already sailed away. Caesar besieged the city, but a siege wouldn't do any good once Pompey's ships returned. He ordered a small fleet built and used them to haul dirt and rocks and wood out into the harbor. They used the material to begin building a barrier or a breakwater to prevent the Pompeians from escaping. Pompey couldn't let this happen. He responded by sending out ships of his own to slow down the construction. There was skirmishing back and forth for several days, and before Caesar could complete his breakwater, the Pompeian fleet returned. Pompey and the rest of his supporters set sail for Greece. They would live to fight another day. This was a missed opportunity for Caesar. But
it was, but it shows the brilliance of Caesar in that he has very three-dimensional thinking. He's not just thinking about the siege, but he's also thinking about what comes next and how do they deal with that. And his armies have notoriously been brilliant when it comes to engineering feats, building bridges faster than people thought they could and building fortifications faster than people thought they could. And this gives him an advantage in war that many of his opponents don't have.
But nevertheless, the Pompeian flight meant that Italy was now firmly under his control.
Yep.
It had been approximately 2 months since Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He was now finally free to enter Rome. The reception was not what he expected. The place was a ghost town.
Yeah.
Those who could had fled the city. Those who couldn't opted to stay indoors. After all, Caesar was a traitor, an enemy of the Republic, and people had good reason to expect a bloodbath. But Caesar wasn't here for blood. He needed something else. Upon entering the city, he immediately called for a meeting of the Senate. Rome's best and brightest had gone with Pompey, but there were a few senators still in the city. Caesar told this little makeshift Senate that he wanted access to Rome's treasury. He was desperate. He was already paying his legions with IOUs, and he
not only paying his legions, but paying bribes to people to get what he wanted. He's been dishing out a lot of IOUs, and his success means being able to follow up on those. So he has to be able to do that.
He would need to continue paying them for at least another year, now that Pompey had escaped to Greece. Caesar gave some BS justification for this request, saying that since Rome no longer had to worry about fighting the Gauls, the money previously spent on that should go to him instead. His reasoning didn't make any sense, but it didn't need to. None of the senators objected. In fact, none of the senators said anything.
None of the senators who would have objected are still there.
Caesar decided to interpret their silence as approval, which was not how voting worked, but whatever. Then, one of the few remaining...
It kind of is, though. I mean, I don't know the exact details here. Obviously, this is not the full Senate, and so really, you can argue that they shouldn't be making any decisions, but you can, by unanimous consent, if no one opposes something, interpret that to mean that they approve of it.
Tribunes of the plebs, a guy named Metellus, summoned his courage and vetoed Caesar's request.
Good for
Caesar
him.
stormed out of the Senate House. He ordered his legionaries to occupy the Forum and led a group of soldiers up to the Temple of Saturn, which housed the Roman treasury. When he got there, the temple was locked and boarded up. Metellus stood before the entrance, blocking Caesar's path and continuing to exercise his veto. Caesar approached Metellus and told him that if he didn't get out of the way, he would order his men to murder him right there, before the gods and everyone. After a beat, Metellus decided to step aside. Caesar proceeded to plunder the Republic's treasury and immediately began to settle up on his IOUs. Up until this incident, Caesar had consistently argued that he was on the right side of the law. By coming into Rome and threatening to murder public officials, he demonstrated how untrue that was. The rule of law was dead. The rule
of law was dead on both sides. Again, I'm not defending Caesar because he's in the wrong for sure in some of his actions, but this was an escalation by both sides. Both sides are continually upping the ante by doing the wrong thing. So there's plenty of blame to go around.
Was in the hands of a conquering warlord. Even though Caesar controlled Italy, he was still beset with enemies on all sides, which meant that he had an important decision to make. Pompey was in Greece with 2 or 3 legions, and was already rallying the combined strength of the East to his banner. Pompey also had 7 legions active in Spain, which were continuing to operate independently. Caesar joked that to his west there was an army without a general, and to his east there was a general without an army. He could only deal with one of these threats at a time, but which would it be, east or west? After some deliberation, Caesar decided to head west to deal with Spain first. Here was his reasoning. At this moment, Pompey was in no position to attack. If Caesar spent a year campaigning in Spain, Italy would be relatively safe. The opposite was not true. If Caesar spent a year campaigning in Greece, Italy would probably fall to the Spanish legions. Spain was the immediate threat.
Makes sense.
Greece was the future threat. The immediate threat had to be dealt with first.
So a little bit of a kind of a vibe of the Schlieffen plan in World War I for the Germans. Deal with the immediate threat because the long-term threat's going to take a little bit longer to be a problem. So we're going to deal with the West first because by the time the East is ready to go, we'll have dealt with the West.
This must have been an agonizing decision. Caesar understood that Pompey would become more and more powerful as the war dragged on. In his absence, Caesar would leave behind Mark Antony as the informal governor of Italy. Had things gone differently, this would have been Labienus' job, but he was with the Pompeians now, and Caesar needed a new number two that he could rely on. For the moment, Antony was that man, although as we'll discover, good help is hard to find, and Antony was no Labienus.
Yeah, but we don't know what Labienus would have done in a civil position. We know him as a good general who had been a right-hand man for Caesar, but that doesn't mean that would have translated to being a great leader of the civilian populace in Rome.
Caesar prepared to split his army. He sent 3 legions to capture Sicily, with orders to continue on to Africa if they were successful. He sent another legion to capture Sardinia, which was close enough to Italy that they could return if something went wrong. Both of these expeditions would require naval support, which meant that Caesar would travel to Spain with his remaining 3 legions on foot. Finally, he sent orders to his 6 remaining legions in Gaul, instructing them to break camp and get themselves to Spain as quickly as possible. They would beat him there, but that was fine because time was of the essence. Every day Caesar spent in Spain, Pompey would be gathering strength in Greece.
All right. So as I mentioned, if you haven't already, please consider heading over there and subscribing to Historia Civilis. Let's get them a little bit closer to that magic number of 1 million subscribers. Would love for our followers here to be a small part of making that happen. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.